The greatest of all times. The greatest of all times. Say it one more time. The greatest of all times. Now that's something that's often said when you're listening to commentary at fights. What else do you usually hear? Best pound for pound fighter. Now those two things to me mean two separate things. Greatest of all times is self-explanatory. Well, that's the greatest out of every one of the fighters in that class. Not division, but that class. Now, pound for pound fighter, to me, means it can be a fighter at any weight, but in theory, that fighter would beat a heavier weight or lighter weight based on the skill set and the things that they've shown throughout the history of their fights. So to me, they're two different things, but oftentimes when you watch an event, I hear the best, if it's a championship contender, there's talk of them being the best pound for pound coming up, their potential for best pound for pound, or somebody that just wins the belt. There's talk of them being the best pound for pound. Sometimes there's even talk of them being the greatest of all times before they received the belt, or maybe they just won the belt and hadn't defended the belt. Of course, we've seen that talk with Conor McGregor coming up, not defending his belt, but winning the belt. Best pound for pound, best of all times, greatest of all times. We've heard things like that from different contenders, but I want to read off some stats for you guys. And some of these stats are older stats, some of these stats are newer stats, but put some of these things in perspective about the greatest of all times. And these are in no particular order. Just basically the order that I've searched them in. We can take, because it's fresh on my mind, Amanda Nunes. She's a former champion, just lost her belt last night. Her fight record, 21. I think it's 21-6 now. That's her record since 2011. She's fought 27 fights. George St. Pierre, 26-2. He's fought since 2002, or that's his record since 2002, 28 total fights. Anderson Silva, 34-11. His record since 2000 with 45 fights. Francis Ngannou, 16-3. Since 2015, he's fought 19 fights. Kamaru Usman, 20-1. That's his record since 2015, 21 fights. BJ Penn, 16-14-2. His record since 2001 with 32 fights. Nick Diaz, 26-10. That's his record since 2003, 36 fights. Nate Diaz, 21-13. His record since 2004 with 34 fights. Run these down kind of quick. Demetrius Johnson, 31 fights. TJ Dillashaw, 22 fights. Dominic Cruz, 27 fights. Uriah Faber, coming in at 35-11. His record since 2006 with 46 fights. We have Ronda Rousey with just 14 fights. We have Miguel Torres, 44-9. He has 53 fights. Now, some other guys from the old school, depending on when you started watching or keeping up with MMA, Randy Couture, total of 30 fights. Chuck Liddell, only scratching the surface at around 29 fights. Rich Franklin, around 38 fights. So that tells you some of the experience of the guys, the MMA fighters that's been around, some old school, some new school. Now, we watch history take place with some of the fighters, and we know why they stopped fighting, and some just retire, some aren't as healthy as others and can't continue the fight game because we know the toll that it takes on your body. But when you're looking at the greatest of all times, you're pretty much looking at, the amount of fights that somebody had, how many fights they won based on how many fights they lost. Maybe it's how they won those fights. You may have somebody with a short fight record, somebody that has a big name, somebody like Ronda Rousey with just 14 fights and has 14 MMA fights, but has a big name and is in the talk for the like the greatest of all times, and still in the talk for pound best fighter. Just looking at stats based on what they done, she finished a lot of people. So when you finish a lot of people, that says something about your skill set. But you also have to take into account the type of competition that you have, the level of competition that you had, and the time that you came along. Because there's some fighters like her that would far advanced than some of the people that she fought, and met up with some people later in her career who had just as much experience in a more diverse game that had the tools to beat her style. Doesn't make her a bad fighter, but does it make her best pound for pound? Does it make her the greatest of all times? Well, you can also look at Anderson Silva. Anderson Silva with 45 fights, and you see his record, his fight record since 2000, and you see the manners of which he won a lot of his fights in. And a lot of his fights were either by knockout or submission. There's more knockouts later in the career. Some of his losses came in interesting manners. One I know was a disqualification. I think he struck a ground opponent, so he did have a DQ in there. He did have one match overturned. And there was, I believe, another time he got a heel hook, he got submitted. So there was the aspects of his game that were, he met up against some people that had a better style than him and finished him. And you take somebody like Miguel Torres, who has 53 fights and won a lot of fights by knockout. Also lost some fights by knockout. And you compare those records together and the amount of fights. There's only other one in the top that's had that many fights, and that's Uriah Faber. At the 35 and 11, he had a total of 46 fights, with the 11 losses. A lot of people compared him to guys like Miguel Torres. A lot of them compared him to guys like BJ Penn, and wanted to see those people fight each other just because you want to know who has the better skill set at the time, even though one guy's record may be different than the next. We saw Cruz and Faber fight, which Faber has way more fights than Cruz. Cruz only had 27 fights, and he's in the talk now. It was in the talk for greatest of all times and best pound for pound. But when you look at all these fighters and some of the talk that goes on between some of the news and media outlets and even some of the announcers, they've always been in the talk for pound or the greatest of all times or one of the greatest of all times. So one of the things I look at it, like I said before, is the record and the amount of fights that you had versus in the mannerisms that you won the fights. And every time when I think of those, it's one name that comes up, and it's Anderson Silva, just because of the way he won and the things that he done inside the ring or the cage and when he fought, because he was reckless and he still won. He was reckless and he lost. He was also skillful in several different ways in some of the fights that you watch. If you hadn't seen his older fights, you need to go watch them. He fought more than just UFC. Same with, Miguel Torres. You watch his older fights and you watch some of his later fights, is a totally different fighter. It's another one that went in there and you can say he was reckless and he won a lot of fights. He knocked a lot of people out and he finished fights. And that kind of reminds me of Kenny Florian when he announced in the cage, said who he is and that he finishes fights. But my belief in MMA is when you walk in there, you go in there and you go straight after the finish. You don't really go in there looking for a decision, because we know how decisions turn out. It's always been proven ground, in my opinion. When you go in there, you look for the submission or you look for the knockout. You look for the doctor stoppage. You look for the straight line to victory is what you want. And that's why I used to like the Pride rules, because you have that 10-minute first round. It's a long first round. It's a long time to fight. And they would yellow card you if you tried to take your foot off the gas. They wanted you to go in there and the best person win. It's like a free for all, not necessarily a brawl, but you go straight for the win. And, just in my opinion, that's the way I like to see people fight. That's why I like to call those guys, with that skill set going in there and the way they fought. That's why I call them some of the greatest of all times. Not a pick one. That's a hard decision. But I will let you guys pick one. So if you're listening to the podcast, drop me a line, make a comment, let me know who your greatest of all time is, or maybe it's your best pound for pound fighter, which pound for pound is a totally different type of conversation than the greatest of all times. Because it could, pound for pound could be somebody like BJ Penn that's versatile in all areas. Just to point out some of his fights, if you watch his championship fights at 155, and some of the last times that he won fights was his championship run at 155 in the UFC. If you watch the way he finished some of those guys, it was one fight that comes to mind is just a Diego Sanchez when he split his head open. Some of the damage that he inflicted to those guys was it's phenomenal. Even the fight that he lost against George St. Pierre, he put GSP in the hospital. He lost the fight, but he put GSP in the hospital. And there's another guy, I can't remember his name right off the top of my head, but it was one of the bloodiest fights that I've seen in the UFC. And dude's blood was all over the cage. And I think he rear naked choked him with all the blood soaked on top of him, on his gloves, and it was a mess. But just go back, look at some of those. If you're new to MMA and hadn't heard any of these names before, go look them up and watch some of the older fights. The majority of them did have some fights in Pride, and those would be the ones to go watch. Now, I didn't look up everybody's record. I looked up a few old school guys, looked up a few new school guys to throw in here. But I made sure I put my favorites on the list. What are your favorites? Let me know, and I'll get with you guys in the next episode. And I appreciate you for listening. Share this with somebody and let them know about the Mega Talks podcast.